Good afternoon, everyone. I'm joined today by Ethan Janowski, who heads up marketing for Placer.ai for today's workshop, which is titled Rebuilding Retail. We're here at a bit of a unique time. COVID's still raging in some parts of the world, while others are figuring out what life is going to look like afterwards. And almost a year and a half into the pandemic, it's kind of easy to overlook just how much is up for grabs at the moment, if you like, and just how open to question and reinterpretation some of the fundamentals of society are. Like whether we're talking about the role of physical real estate or the patterns of people's lives, where people live, where they work, how they move. We can't really assume anything based on the past. So today's session takes place at what I see, and I'm sure Ethan agrees, is a tipping point. We're talking against a background of some of the biggest shifts in living memory. And in a way that very few other industries are, retail's exposed to almost every element of that change, which makes it essential that retail strategies are reshaped to fit a future that nearly 18 months ago, none of us expected to be in. Now, we've got a good mix of people in the audience today across brands, across retail, across education. So I've opened up a poll for viewers that you can take part in at your leisure. And what we're interested to find out before we really get into the weeds is precisely which parts of the post-pandemic picture are the most troubling for you right now, the bits you're the most concerned about. If none of the options fit, then feel free to contribute a suggestion in the chat, and we'll come back and we'll analyze those results shortly. Now, over the next hour, Ethan and I are going to look at the shape of the market as it stands today in detail, and we're going to try and paint the most accurate picture we can of selling fashion and consumer goods at this historic juncture. And throughout, we're also going to be looking longer term as well. We're going to be looking at why and how retail can rebuild based on a foundation of current, objective, and actionable data. I'm going to turn over to Ethan in a minute, and he's going to give us an initial sort of top-level brief on our data sources, which come directly from Placer itself. And then we're going to get into the specifics, and we're going to try and get through as much of those specifics as we can over the next hour. We've had a look at the deck ahead of time, and there's a chance we may not get through everything, but we're going to try our very, very best. What I will say though is, if you have a question at any point, put it in the chat, and I will put it to Ethan and myself, and we'll try and answer it as we go. I think that's the best way, because for anyone who's attended these Interline Initiator sessions before, and I know a few people who've registered have, we want them to be as open a discussion as possible. And I know Ethan and I as well. Anything we don't get to question-wise as we're presenting, we're also happy to pick up lines of inquiry and lines of questioning via email after the workshop. Ethan, I'm going to turn over to you. Just bring up the other presentation for you, and I'll let you run at a few slides.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. And thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here. So what we wanted to do to start off was just give you a sense of the data that you're going to be seeing today, and obviously understand what it does show and what it doesn't show, because there are limitations to any data source, even one as fantastic as Placer. And so we are a location data company, which means that we're showing essentially, if you think people vote with their feet, we're showing you how they vote across the United States every single day. To get that data, we observe a panel of over 30 million devices throughout the United States. Critically, this is all anonymized aggregate data. We are a kind of privacy by design company. So everything is GDPR and CCPA compliant. And we are looking at the macro trends. It's not an advertising platform. We're trying to understand what's happening in the wider scale in the sector and not looking at the individual. We observe this panel of devices, and we leverage the kind of most advanced algorithms in machine learning and AI to make estimations on foot traffic to any retail location anywhere in the country. We then present all of that data in our platform in a range of different reports. So everything from visit trends to the customer journey to void analysis, demographics, competitive benchmarking, and a whole lot more in our premium platform. We also have a free version of the tool. So anyone who is interested or has their kind of, is intrigued by these ideas, please check out that free version. We also have a section on our website called The Square at placer.ai-the Square. And it has a whole series of free tools that you can kind of play with at your leisure. And those are even simpler than our kind of free version. But I think we really do believe in the importance and value of this data. And so it's always a really big piece of our philosophy to make sure that we were exposing at least some of it openly and for free. So please check that out if you're interested. And now, Ben, let's get into it.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Ethan. So based on, if you're just observing the news, which I'm sure we all do, it's been kind of difficult to get a handle on how the retail recovery is actually progressing, right? So in this year alone, the six, 7 months we've seen best week in years stacked side by side against year-on-year slumps and like ongoing uncertainty. So what data points do you guys have to substantiate just how far COVID has set retail, especially fashion retail, back? And what trends can you draw from the pace of the recovery right now?
Yeah, an important question. And I think you kind of prefaced it perfectly in the sense that you're hearing a lot of different things come in. And that's because there's a variety of different players and a variety of different atmospheres using a variety of different data sources. So in some cases, and we saw this throughout the pandemic, just changes in behavior can be difficult to understand within context. But I do think it's so important to have that table setting moment to understand where are we really. So what you're seeing in these graphs that are on the left is a year over 2 year comparison. So it's looking at weekly data for the overall retail visits throughout the United States compared to the equivalent week in 2019. And to the right, you're seeing the same graph, the same numbers compared to 2020. And this is where you get this, everything's better than it's ever been. We have a long way to go. In some sectors, it's great. In others, it's more difficult. And it's because you have all these different comparisons. That 2019 comp is likely the most important because it's that last period of so-called normalcy. But even that, you think about, we're heading into this really important back to school season. It's going to be really critical to remember what was going on in 2019. So for example, there are some weeks that see a boost because, Easter was later in 2021 than it was in 2019. Or the 2019 back to school season was exceptionally strong. So it's going to be more difficult. If a brand is hitting 2019 levels in the next few months, they're doing exceptionally well, not just okay. And I think these are all elements that are really important to contextualize data with. And just as one kind of final example of that, we saw it in February. February was a worse month for most nationwide brands in the US than January was, and obviously significantly off the pace of March, excuse me. And it wasn't because they were weaker or the pace of recovery had really shifted. It was because there was massive weather conditions in Texas and in New York and in, throughout the South and major areas of the country where retailers tend to have a large number of locations. So all these elements are really important when we're trying to understand what the data means.
And the element of the retail recovery that concern people the most, it's changes in consumer behavior. That's emerged out there. And second is difficulties in delivering omnichannel excellence. So I don't think we need to address those directly right now, but we can definitely use those to color the conversation as we go on from here.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. So let's talk migration then. So in the earliest days of the pandemic, people, probably myself included, were predicting like a mass exodus from cities. You could easily picture. I don't know if anybody went into cities, but they were deserted for a while, and it was reasonable to infer that might go on indefinitely. So, and right now, that concern still seems current. You have governments who are concerned that corporations are going to pull out of city office leases, and you're going to have whole city center areas that are effectively ghost towns, and you have people concerned in hospitality and retail that foot traffic is just going to dry up. So based on the data that you have, is that movement out of cities for work and housing, is that actually taking place, for one thing? And for another, what else can the data tell us about the future of city center retail?
This is one of those trends that I think in the early days of the pandemic, there were things that we were kind of losing our minds, and there was narratives that made no sense. And there were some that were really rooted in something serious and significant. And I think this is one of the latter, in the sense that it's very real, but even that requires context. So what you're seeing in this graph is CBSA data. So it's kind of a way of breaking down areas in the country in the US. One way is CBSA is centered around kind of major cities, but areas around it. And what you're seeing is that there are major cities did get hit hard, but not every city is the same. And some were hit harder than others. But in most cases, especially with major cities, and this is a deep emphasis on like New York here or Los Angeles, it wasn't that everybody left the entire region. It was usually there was a change by degree of magnitude. And what I mean by that is the 37-year-old living in New York with 2 kids in a small apartment moved to New Jersey. So they're still within commuting distance. They were probably already considering moving beforehand, and they're leaving. At the same time, that's really significant because you're talking about an individual who has more money to spend potentially, going to the suburbs with that money to spend, while potentially maintaining some degree of relationship with the city. The flip side is also true though, because it's not like these places have remained empty. So when you look at New York as a specific example, there's a great company called Urban Digs that has data on leases being signed and the cost of leases. And what they found is that leases were actually up in January and February, the number of leases that were signed, but the costs were way down, meaning more people were coming and paying lower rents. And there was also these other indications, a great report in Bloomberg about how it's likely younger people who are coming into the city. And so what we're seeing again is this speeding up of a process that probably would have been great had it happened a few years earlier, of those who had been kind of hanging on by the fingernails to stay in the city that they love, and those who had been priced out of those markets. And it's interestingly, we're seeing the recoveries in some of these, cool millennial Gen Z hubs like, Brooklyn or Queens actually take longer to recover than New York City because people can now afford the heart, of the area. That said, there are real retail implications to both of these shifts, and I would argue that they're actually massive opportunities. So on the one hand, younger audiences being in cities creates a pull for different types of retailers and a reasoning to be there just from a brand interaction experience perspective. And the same thing, we kind of mentioned it before, for the suburban areas as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it follows, I guess, that you could be seeing a big opportunity in suburban retail, right? So what does that possibility space look like? And if we put ourselves in the mind of addressing the brands and retailers we have in the audience today, what guidance would you give them for capitalizing on that opportunity?
So I think it's a really important question. And what you're seeing in this graph is our mall index. Our mall index analyzes 100 indoor malls and 100 outdoor lifestyle and outlet centers in the US. And the outdoor centers are in the reddish, and the indoor malls are in what I call blue, but I get harassed that it's actually purple. So I'll leave that to the kind of the kind of listener to decide what the real color is. But
that is definitely purple.
You know what? I don't know what my problem is, but I'm going. I don't know. This is my issue. But I think that as we were kind of discussing this, there is a huge opportunity in the suburbs now, and it's a few reasons. One, people with disposable income coming out of the city, looking for something to do, a place to go, and malls are already transitioning, especially in the U.S., to say, hey, we need less retail, more food and beverage, more experiences, and that's actually better for everybody because it says to the consumer, oh, here's a place where I can go and have a full day, get a great meal, maybe, take in some experience that's really exciting. And it's better for retail because there's less competition for those retail eyeballs, right? I'm going to spend more time in a store. I'm less overwhelmed about where I want to go, but it's also going to force retailers to be much more focused on where they want to be. So it's not like everyone's in the good mall. There's going to be less retail space. And so there's probably going to be more competition for those Class A malls in terms of who wants to set up shop there. And it's going to push retailers to be more creative about the other locations they want to be. So whether that's downtown areas in not the most exciting or not the major city, but that, bridge city. I think one of the things that always surprises me is when you talk to people who are outside of the US, like Charlotte's a huge city that you don't talk about a lot. Austin is a huge city that we don't talk about a lot. It's not all San Francisco, LA, New York, Chicago. There's so many other places, and there are going to be opportunities to reach them. And the question is, which brands are really taking that extra step now to understand where do I have audiences and markets that are a good fit for me? And what's the right format for me to reach them? Because again, whether it's suburban, different types of models for what I want out of a location, or it's different places than I would have normally looked, there are huge opportunities to reach audiences. As an example, a brand that I love is Untuck It. Untuck It is a great company that creates shirts that are meant not to be tucked in, right? Really awesome name too. And as much as they're a cool, hip, digitally native brand, they also really speak to a great 30s and 40s audience that is in the suburbs. And having a location, even in a strip center, kind of makes sense now, and definitely in an outlet center, certainly in a major mall, as opposed to just being in these kind of primary, urban locations.
A bit, and it's now neck and neck between the one we mentioned before and delivering omnichannel excellence. So that's good timing for what we're going to talk about now. Now, I don't know about you, but it feels like the word omnichannel has been with us for a heck of a long time. I mean, I remember going to an NRF show in New York in what must have been 2018, I guess, when we could still get on planes. And I remember even back then, so that's a good few years ago, influential people saying, "Oh, omnichannel, the term's been run into the ground. It's just synonymous with retail these days." Things have changed a lot though since 2018, and I think omnichannel, multi-channel strategies they've been stress tested by the last 12 to 18 months in a way that nobody could have foreseen. So from your point of view and from the data's perspective, what has COVID taught us about the reality of how different channels are and aren't blurring, what omnichannel really means right now, and how retailers can adapt?
It's great. And I would say that if I participate in the poll, my choice is omnichannel. And it's largely because of what you just said, that, of course, everyone knows omnichannel is the most important thing. Yet if you actually look at how many retailers have truly embraced what omnichannel means, that list is really small. And I think part of it is because when we looked at omnichannel initially, we said brick and mortar is a real thing, and omnichannel is digital. So it's using digital channels to support brick and mortar, or as e-commerce or whatever. The flip side is also true, and I think this is one of the big elements that we're missing in terms of truly maximizing what omnichannel is supposed to provide us. And that's, we're not giving physical retail the credit it deserves. And this could be a US problem only, and maybe other countries have figured this out better. But locations are penalized by returns in store, right? So if I buy a shirt, go back to the store, return it, that location, that's taken off as a sale, right? Even though a return in a location is significantly cheaper than a return done online, right? And there's this much higher likelihood of upsell that goes with it. The logistical value of a location is completely passed over when trying to understand the value of a store. So the fact that I can, deliver more effectively, have buy online, pick up in store. We were talking to a retailer once, they're like, "Oh yeah, it's a digital channel." Like, it's not just a digital channel. For buy online, pick up in store to work, there must by definition be a store to pick up from. And even the marketing value, if you think, I come from the tech world, we look at our impressions, we look at our visits to the website, at the interactions, and we talk about how our brand grows because of that. How many companies are giving credit to the store as a marketing touch point? Here's how many people visited a location, and therefore we're giving added weight to the value that store provides. And you think, we're showing in this graph the true trade area of locations. So in the Dallas one, that's a neighborhood goods, which is this really cool, new department kind of concept. On the right on the left is a, I'm forgetting the name, so forgive me, but it's a digitally native brand that does Everlane. It's Everlane. It's a location in New York. And you're seeing the massive reach that these stores provide, that if a sale happens later, I walk into that Everlane location in New York, and I only buy something 2 weeks later when I go back to my house in Connecticut. Isn't the store part of that process? Didn't it have a huge impact? Isn't it providing uplift for my e-commerce? And I think until we start to embrace all of the values that all of the different channels provide, all of the incredible benefits that digital channels give us, and all of the benefits that physical retail gives us, we're going to miss out on how to optimize our reach. And I think one of the most exciting use cases for location data has been in helping retailers understand the full value of their locations to improve the way they view their wider mix. And I think the added element to that here, and I know I'm bordering on rant here, but still, the added element is the ownership of what omnichannel means per brand. So my favorite example of this is Burlington Coat Factory, which is a big off-price retailer in the US. They shut down their e-commerce in February of 2020. So a month before the pandemic, and they got clobbered. There were wonderful articles written about how this was a terrible decision and shows how outdated they are and how they can't survive in the future. And yet, if you look at the recovery data for Burlington, they're absolutely destroying. They are crushing. They're seeing massive growth compared to 2019. They're on an amazing trajectory. And it's because e-commerce, the way it's done for every other apparel player, doesn't make sense for Burlington. Burlington is eventually going to have a digital offering, but it should be oriented towards what do Burlington customers want from the Burlington experience, not just, hey, I saw that Target does this, therefore I'm going to try and copy. And I think it's so important to recognize that every retailer is different, and you can learn from other retailers, and you should try to see what they're doing to get a better sense of what might work for you. But it is not a copy and paste industry. It is a find a concept and understand how does it fit for my audience and my market.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as a concept, by definition, it should go beyond the transactional, I guess, is, to try and wrap that up a bit. Not that I didn't enjoy the rant, but I'm trying to think of a way to tie a bow around it. But yeah, if you're looking at the competition, you're trying to figure out what makes sense for you as a brand, as a direct to consumer brand, as a retailer. It's to look beyond where the sales taking place and to look into all those other touch points that influence other behavior, and to come up with something that makes sense for you. I think that kind of leads us into where we are now, which is there's two ways I think that we can look at the idea of brands and retailers pulling away from cities or from malls, or any other large scale change. One way is it's an indictment of traditional retail, right? It's a statement that the way things were working, it wasn't fit for the future and change was inevitable. The other is as a more natural progression towards something new, towards a new shape. What's your take on that?
So I had the same kind of experience where we were watching brands do things that didn't always feel like they made perfect sense, and they were being taken negatively. We were watching brands that were trying new things and everyone was going, oh my God, this is brilliant. And much of it was, were they succeeding or were they struggling beforehand? And it makes sense, right? If a brand that's struggling doesn't get the same benefit of the doubt of a brand that's crushing. But I think there's a similar lens that needs to be applied. And that's the reason why we did a slide with Sephora, Gap, and Dollar General, obviously companies that we always think of in the same, we always speak in the same breath. And if you think of Dollar General, again, dollar-oriented store, super value-related. They launched Pop Shelf, which is a more upmarket concept. If you look at Sephora, they're pulling out of just malls and urban areas, going to suburban environments, locating mini stores within Kohl's, which is the big department store chain. Look at Gap, they're kind of leaving the mall. They're trying to figure out other formats. And all of it, I think, needs to be viewed within this lens of diversification. Because the reality is, the idea of, hey, this worked for us in this market, let's just go copy and paste it everywhere we possibly can. They're realizing that that's not the right way to work in every market. And if you have a multitude of different offerings that you can effectively manage, and these are larger brands, they're larger companies, they have the resources, you want to understand what's the right format in each place. And take a brand that I think we're gonna kind of sing their praises a little bit later as well, like Target or Lululemon is another great example. They have multiple different types of formats that they deploy in different markets in order to reach to maximize that specific location. So that, Lululemon has some locations where they have a drinks bar and they have yoga studio and they have, whatever experiential concepts they want to deploy. And they have others that are just about selling product. And Target has large format stores where they have everything under the sun because they're selling to like a family in the suburbs. And they have a store in East Lansing, Michigan, next to a major university that is overloaded with merchandising oriented towards college students. And that's exactly the way to approach retail for these larger companies. How do we merchandise? How do we set up our format on a per space basis so that we can bring the right products to the right people as effectively as possible and in the most efficient way possible?
Switching gears a little bit. Aside from the questions around, the movement of people, the future of shopping centers, department stores, there's a wider question around who wants to own the brand to consumer channel, the retail to consumer channel. We've seen some major brands, Nike is a good example that you gave me, of people who've pushed very publicly back to take back ownership of their relationship with their customers, and they've had positive results from doing it. Now, are those popular examples, those big things that are held out as exemplars, are they translating into broader change? Are other brands taking similar steps to reassert control of their customer relationships? And if so, how big of an impact does the data suggest that's going to have on channels to market?
So I think it's the first white paper we ever wrote, the first major trend we ever talked about was this, which was direct-to-consumer, product-oriented brands owning the retail experience. And I think it is probably the most significant trend in all of retail when we think about things that are going to impact the wider landscape over the next decade or so. And it has huge implications for department stores. It has huge implications for kind of big brands that sell a lot of other people's products. It has obviously massive implications for the brands themselves. And I think most of them are very positive. Now, obviously for department stores, it likely means, it means two things. One, a push to understand that you need to have a brand that is beyond just the products you're selling. I need to trust you as the discovery channel, not just as the place where I can go find $10 off of a Nike product. But it also is pushing these brands to evolve, understand their own different concepts. So look at Macy's. They have a Market by Macy's smaller concept that they utilize alongside their larger department store. Bloomingdale's just launched one. Nordstrom's has just had one deployed in Washington, D.C. This is all really positive for that space. When you look at the product brands and what Nike, Lululemon, Under Armour, others mean for this, for the wider sector, it has a really significant impact in the sense that, one, they want to own the customer relationship because they recognize that the customer relationship is about more than just the sale. It's how do I build the relationship so that it's longer lasting and that it comes offline and online and I can reach them in all these different touch points. But it also says something really interesting about what retail is going to look like, because it's going to be less companies with hundreds of stores and more companies with 100 to 200, and more brands that with 100 to 200 stores, that longer tail being a more significant piece. And imagine, as we discussed earlier, mall is moving away from the same proportion of retail that they had in the past. That means more differentiation, and more differentiation is very good for retail because, I grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania. In Allentown, Pennsylvania, there's one mall in 20 minutes in one direction, another mall 20 minutes in the other direction. And it's all the same experience. It's the same food court, the same retailers. And you have the one you like and there's no reason to go to the other one. But if retail and experiences and the tenant mix is differentiated, all of a sudden there's a reason to go to both. And so one weekend you go to the one that has great food because it has this type of, you go see a movie and you have food, and the next weekend you go to the one that has, there's a mall in New Jersey now that has skiing in it. And so you go to do that. Like it creates a more complementary mix that could increase the overall pie. And that's why it's a win for the retailers. It's a win ultimately for the consumers, and it's a win for the landlords themselves. And I think that's why this is such a significant trend, because it creates a potentially better future for what the wider retail landscape.
Because there are, you have, it's not just malls, it's not just department stores, you have several kind of instances where people are competing directly with one another, and they don't necessarily have to. There's the opportunity for differentiation. There's the opportunity to have complementary offers to deliver different experiences. Cool. Okay, so when we talked before the workshop, a subject came up, which I know is another one that's kind of close to your heart, which is the death of the middle, in inverted commas. And that's the idea that the two extreme ends of the retail spectrum, luxury and then low price, high volume, are thriving, while the middle is on a downward trajectory, getting compressed. From what I understand, though, the data suggests the opposite. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I was in love with the idea of the death of the middle. I read it in lots of Forbes and Inc. articles. I felt very smart. I said things like the bifurcation of retail, and it made me feel awesome. And I was like a little mini professor. And then when I looked at the data, I was like, it doesn't actually make sense. And in order for it to make sense, you have to kind of change the rules of the game. So if you think about kind of luxury, if I tell you name 10 luxury brands, it's not going to be very hard. You're going to do it quickly. We have a real sense of what luxury means. If I say name value brands, it's also pretty quick. Walmart, Dollar General, Big Lots, Five Below. You can kind of, they roll off the tongue. They're very clearly oriented towards extreme value. When you think of the middle, it's more difficult because you're essentially operating in a sphere that is less easy to define. But if you actually look at the wider retail landscape, some of the most successful brands, period, are the ones that are most effectively targeting the middle. And just maybe the best example of that is Target, right? So Target is seeing tremendous growth when you look at monthly visits compared to 2019. And part of the reason is they're operating in a lane without very much competition. So Walmart is, while they are an absolute behemoth, they're a brilliantly run company. They make amazing decisions. They have a really amazing retail channel. They're arguably the strongest retailer on planet Earth. They have a lot of competition, and you are watching their visit share go to players like Dollar General and Family Dollar and Big Lots. Target's not seeing that, and it's because they operate in the middle. And one of the things someone said to me is, oh, but they're a value player. A value player doesn't have Apple in their stores. They don't have Casper in their stores. They don't have Disney in their stores. Ben, we both talked about our children. Anyone who's ever bought a Disney branded toy for their children knows that it is not the cheapest toy to buy. It is 10 times more than the exact same thing that's kind of a mini knockoff, right? And that's because what Target understands is what people are willing to spend on and what people want to spend a little bit less on and how to orient that. And that's exactly the essence of the middle. We are ready to spend money on certain items and we want to save on certain items. And brands that get that are the ones who are really thriving. Ulta is another great example. Kohl's is a perfect example of this. And the Sephora combination is absolutely brilliant. Dick's Sporting Goods, another fantastic example. And what's beyond the fact that these are just well-run brands who really know who they are, they have so much less competition because we had all become so convinced that these two extremes of the market were where you needed to be, whereas in the reality, there's a huge opportunity in the middle. And I think what we're going to find more and more, Dollar General launching Top Shelf, Walmart raising prices, Five Below raising prices, are trying to tap into that middle sphere.
In looking back at the poll, the answer that came third was uncertainty around consumer behavior, foot traffic. Where are people going to be? What are they going to want? And that's one of the biggest questions hanging over retail right now. Now that the pandemic is hopefully waning in some of the biggest consumption markets, is the question of whether the last 18 months have permanently altered shopping behaviors, or whether this is more of a transient sort of thing. So based on your insights, how much have things really changed and how durable is that change likely to be in behavioral terms?
So in terms of our data, it looks, the world today looks a lot more like it did pre-pandemic from a retail behavior perspective than it did at any point during the pandemic. And this is with, again, pandemic was, I'm not telling anyone anything they don't know, it was an extended period of time. Behaviors, quote unquote, were sunk in. But the truth is, every time we see retail reopen from a regulatory perspective, people come back. And when we see work and school routines return, people go back to their former routines, which tells us a lot of really interesting things. One, we were doing the things we wanted to do before largely, right? When we say, oh, I hate going to the supermarket, maybe, but you like it more than you do like shopping online. And we're proving that on a daily basis with our feet, right? Maybe we don't want to do certain things on weekends, but when we're given the choice, we do them on weekends. And so I think what we're finding is that these behaviors are a lot more rooted than we had previously given them credit for. What's really interesting is, it was one of the trends that I think most defined the pandemic, the height of the pandemic in terms of retail was mission-driven shopping. Visit fewer locations, buy much more when I'm there, spend more time. And that was one of the things that we said, it's one of the most interesting trends, but it has the least likelihood of lasting. And that's what this data is showing. Visit duration is declining. The weekend visit percentage is increasing. And these are the signs that our behaviors are going back to what they were. And it shows us just how significant routines are. So if you liked going to Starbucks in the morning on your way to work, and now you're going back to work, you're going back to Starbucks. Obviously, I'm overgeneralizing. If you loved, going to the grocery store on a Tuesday, but now you have to be back to work at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, you can't go at 11 like you were. All right, so you're going in the evening or on the weekend like it was pre-pandemic. The caveat here that I don't think we know yet is what work from home means and how long the work from home process lasts and how deep it is. Because if it lasts longer, even a small shift could have a major impact. And it's because of off-peak. So if you think that if I normally was going to work 5 days a week and now I'm going to work 4 days a week, and that Tuesday that I'm not going in, the time that I would have spent commuting at 8:30 in the morning, I'll go to the grocery store and I'll get it done by 9:30. That might make me spend a little bit more time in the grocery, maybe do it a little bit more leisurely, buy a few more products, think a little bit differently about what I'm preparing that week. Even restaurant-wise, if I'm working from home, I do this quite often. Sometimes you just need to get out of your house. So you get in the car, you go to a local coffee shop, and you order a cup of coffee. And because you're going to be sitting there for an hour with a computer, you also order a Danish if you're me, or some other item. And those kind of off-peak visits are really significant because they're almost always net gain for the retailers. And that's the one big caveat in the shopping behavior conversation.
To get out of the house from time to time. It's definitely a force over here. So whenever we're talking retail, there's an elephant in the room, and it's Amazon. So we've already mentioned, brands that are choosing to take control of their engagement of the consumer channel, and these are some of the same brands that have withdrawn from selling through Amazon because they felt that they were ceding too much of that control to a third party, among other reasons. But at the same time, there are some brands who might feel as though they don't have the luxury of making that leap necessarily, or they might think that e-tail partnerships, marketplace partnerships are still valuable to them. So from your point of view, from the data perspective, what role do you see Amazon playing in post-pandemic retail?
So I think there's a few really interesting things with Amazon right now that we're seeing. One within their approach to grocery and one within Prime Day, right? Prime Day is obviously a really significant online commerce holiday, right? But if you actually look at competing brands like Walmart, Target, Best Buy, many others, they all see a major boost from Prime Day, not only online, but offline as well. And one of the things it tells us is that these brands are getting smarter in how they approach things. It doesn't mean Amazon is getting weaker, but it means they are getting smarter in how they do things. And it's a significant shift because I think one of the things we don't necessarily always talk about is that Amazon e-commerce is not a profitable enterprise. Amazon is a massive business with Amazon Web Services is a brilliant company, and a lot of the successes somewhere augment kind of lesser successes elsewhere. They don't have to be. They can kind of chase efficiency and speed over kind of something that a standalone business would need to deal with. And as these other brands get better, it's going to put some more pressure on Amazon. I think the other thing that's really interesting when you look at Amazon is how they approach their owned retail. And I think it's really interesting, specifically in the grocery space. So a few years ago, Amazon bought Whole Foods, which is a higher end grocer. And then they launched Amazon Go, which is kind of a kind of mini mart style, quick in and out format. And then Amazon Fresh, which is a grocery format, kind of fully Amazon grocery format. And what's interesting is I think Whole Foods has taken a hit. And part of it's because Amazon's emphasis on convenience and speed and get the thing I want as quickly as I want doesn't jive perfectly with a brand that's selling you asparagus for $1 more than you would get it at the supermarket down the street. And so what's interesting is how Amazon responded afterwards, launching their own brands that are more oriented towards a lower income audience and competing more directly with cheaper grocery brands. And I think it's interesting because it shows just how smart Amazon is in the sense that they're identifying weaknesses and figuring out their approach to many markets, not just online, where they obviously have a lot of dominance, but in augmenting that strength with a really hard push offline that is trying to figure out where do they really fit within the wider ecosystem.
It's interesting. I've spoken about this before. Amazon has the luxury of having a very different commercial model and an almost an unfair model when it comes to doing this kind of thing because they can afford to sit and wait in those sorts of areas. They can, there are people who invest in Amazon. A lot of people invest in Amazon on the assumption that they will become the dominant player in a given market, and because they have that constant influx of investment with that longer term mindset, they're able to weather losses that other retailers wouldn't be able to. And it's definitely, it creates an imbalance between them and other retail businesses, I think.
Yeah, not always the smartest decision to bet against Amazon, but I think that what's interesting is there are ways to compete. I think this idea of there's a giant in a space, and therefore goodbye everyone else. It's not the case. Again, Nike's a great example. They stopped selling through Amazon, they stopped selling wholesale, and they're doing their best years in ever. I think sometimes owning your process and understanding where you fit within this wider landscape, you can find a tremendous amount of success.
Who have won, essentially, the ones who have been the stars, and they've been the ones that have had the right product categories at the right time. Sectors like DIY, home improvement, and also exercise, athletic equipment, and apparel, that sort of stuff. The undercurrent there has always been that there might be a time limit on that overperformance, right? And that when the world stabilizes, we might see a correction. How are those categories doing now? And what do you think that means for fashion and for pandemic and post-pandemic retail as a whole?
So it's interesting. I think the biggest implication is just for all of us in how we judge what's been happening over the last year and what happens over the next year. And the reason is kind of, what we're showing in this deck. So if you look at that kind of the topmost slide, it's home improvement visits year over year. And the yellow is Home Depot and the green is Lowe's. And they were both down year over year in May 2021. When you look at the slide to the bottom left, they were up year over 2 years. So comparing in May to 2019, they were way up. They're double digits up in terms of visits. And the reason this is so important is there are brands that got hit really, really hard last year. And they're going to be on the recovery. That doesn't necessarily mean that, oh my God, they're doing incredibly well. It means they're recovering. And there are brands on the flip side that did incredibly well during the pandemic that are going to get hit, that are not going to perform as well as they did the year prior. And it's not because they're any weaker. They're in fact stronger. It's just, it was a unique lightning in a bottle moment. And one of the first places we saw this was, we were at a major event and we met someone who asked us for data on a mall in the US. And we looked at the mall and we were like, oh, wow, things are down right now. And when we looked back, it was like, oh, the reason they're down is because they had hit this really unique peak the year prior. And the woman there was like, yeah, it was a Kim Kardashian pop-up in this mall. And it drove crazy amounts of traffic. And what's so fascinating is if you don't know that single detail, you completely misrepresent the data. And I think it's really incumbent upon all of us, whatever role we play, to be considering the varied levels that are happening here, and to understand that not all successes are created equal, and not all declines are created equal, and we need to understand things within the lens of the pandemic and with what we're comparing it to, whether it's pre or post.
Sure, we're going to see an influx of news headlines that are such and such retailer, 30%, 40%, 50% sales slump quarter on quarter or something like, or year on year. And it's important to take the broader context into account and to understand what the baseline was, to understand what the high watermark was, and then to contextualize the figures within that sort of spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool. So thinking now from that point of view, so what brands would you say are the most exciting at the moment? Now we're moving into this weird sort of pandemic, post-pandemic. Nobody quite knows where it is. Like, which are the brands to watch?
So I think Target's an obvious. Ulta is another obvious. These are just brands that really know who they are. They have all the trends working in their favor. And again, they operate within this middle lane where there's less competition. I think some interesting ones that have kind of wider takeaways. If you look at a brand like HomeGoods, they're like an off-price furniture brand. So you're seeing the huge surge for furniture, the value orientation that they provide, really well aligned with where the world is heading. a very strong brand. But I think one of the most surprising ones is Planet Fitness. And I know it's not a classic retailer by any means. It's a gym brand. But here's a company that's came out in a time when everyone was saying, that's it, we don't need to go to the gym. No one's ever going to go to the gym anymore. They're going to work out from home. They're going to buy their Peloton bike or whatever device and goodbye fitness in a club. And instead, they're thriving. They're really rising back. And I think a big part of the reason is they have not changed their philosophy. They're like, we were doing well pre-pandemic. We knew omnichannel was important. We knew this was an opportunity for us to be digital for our customers. And we did that as much as we possibly could to show them how much we care. And then we continued with our model. We're not getting overly caught up in however long-term this short-term change was. We know what works for us, and we're going to continue to be disciplined in what we do. I think that's something that a lot of retailers can learn from, in the sense that, the world changed a lot, and it's going to have changed because of the pandemic. But I think if you look back at other, obviously the COVID's unique, and every kind of crisis situation is unique, but people are tremendously resilient. And if you had an idea that makes sense and a concept that worked beforehand, chances are it's going to continue doing so. But having the discipline to understand, hey, I had a weakness before, I got to fix that if I was succeeding, or I have a strength before, I should just keep on doubling down on that. I think it's going to be a really important element for success in the coming years.
Perfect. And thinking about that and casting our minds forward from here, what would you say are the big post-pandemic shifts in the retail landscape? Anything we can clue the audience and give them a chance to get ahead of? I know you just mentioned flashback to where you were weak, flashback to where you were strong, and extrapolate that from there. But is there anything that you think has really sort of fundamentally shifted that people should be trying to get ahead of?
I think really being focused on, how do I orient myself to my local market? So whether that's multi-format stores and saying, hey, my audience, I'm used to being in kind of bigger format locations, but I want to get into urban areas and it's more expensive. So what's a multi-format look like for me? I think merchandising on a per location basis is something that more brands need to be doing. And Target's the great example. What we're showing in this slide is those are in that true trade area. Those are two Publix locations. Those are two grocers within a mile of each other in Florida, in the same town. And you're showing massive gaps in who's visiting both. This is data from Spatial AI, which is a social demographics provider that works through our platform. And it's really fascinating to see the differences that are in two locations that are so close together. And if I'm orienting my merchandising around that, I'm going to be much more successful. And so I think this idea of, how do I leverage top level strength to enable local focus is something that's going to have a huge impact on the success for different brands.
What's happening with the retailers that were hit the hardest by COVID? What does recovery look like? Are they managing to recover? And in case we have any brands, retailers in the audience that are in that recovery process now, what can the data tell us about staging an effective comeback?
So I think what's interesting is there are different levels of struggle, and there are different approaches, right? And so, you look at, JCPenney and Macy's, which are brands that were hit really hard. They were in the process of right-sizing their fleet, kind of their retail footprint pre-pandemic. That's probably a process that's going to continue. But understanding, hey, like, what is it that makes a Macy's work? One of the things we did a deep analysis of Macy's closures. And we said, are they closing locations based on performance? Are they closing locations based on cannibalization? And what we mean by that is, if there was a story when I had just joined Placer. About a month after I got there was a story that Walmart was closing a handful of supercenters in the United States. And the narrative was essentially, if Walmart's closing supercenters, offline retail might as well give up, right? It's over. The retail apocalypse is here. What we looked at when we looked at the locations they were closing was that they were actually performing pretty darn well. But when you looked at their true trade areas, they were competing with other Walmarts. So the average, so the person was an individual like I'm going out to go to Walmart and I'm saying, hey, should I go to this Walmart or that one? Whereas in theory, a retailer wants to be in a situation where you know exactly which location to go to. And so what we found with Macy's is that they were being really strategic about their right-sizing efforts and closing locations for the right reasons. And so that's a really important thing. Even if you're struggling, it's a great way to figure out how to handle that recovery process in the best possible way. Others like Sephora are asking, well, what do we do to differentiate ourselves? What do we do to move into different areas that we haven't been in the past? That's also really smart and strong. I think you're going to see a lot of creativity come from these situations. And what's interesting is how effectively we see some brands using data to make these processes much more likely to succeed. And it doesn't mean that if I had 1,000 stores that the only success is having 1,200. It means having a successful business. So if you can figure out how to right size and improve the overall business, amazing. And data is a really effective way to help you get there.
We haven't got any questions lined up at the moment. So I do know that we've got a few brands and retailers in the audience, and I'm just wondering now, from your point of view, is there anything we haven't covered? Is there anything that you would say to them when it comes to reorienting, re-strategizing, building a retail strategy that draws from the now, that draws from objective data, that draws from kind of real-time insights as opposed to intuition?
Well, I think it's just that. It's draw from real-time data, draw from objective concepts, not just hunches and guesses. And leveraging data doesn't mean replacing human decision-making. Right?
Yeah.
Contextualizing data requires, great human capacity. Data is an asset. It is a viewpoint. It is a perspective, and we think it's a very critical perspective. But it is just that. And so that leveraging that source of knowledge in order to drive a better outcome, to limit risk, to maximize the chances of success, is a really huge opportunity. And I think we are seeing more brands take advantage of it, and it's something we expect to continue to see grow over time.
Perfect. That's a great way to wrap up. Everybody, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon or morning, depending on your time zone. I know I speak for Ethan and I when I say really appreciate you sparing your time to sit with us. If any questions do come up, the recording will be distributed to everybody via email in the next couple of days. Any questions originate from that, either of us or both of us will be happy to field those. But for the time being, I'll say thanks to the audience for joining us, and I'll say thanks to Ethan for giving us such a valuable perspective.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great day, everyone.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.